devoted to fostering the ethical ideals in everyday life. We emphasize the ethics and human values and an understanding of the conditions and issues, intellectual and social, of the modern era. We seek to learn together the art of living with reason, compassion, responsibility, and cooperation. We affirm our trust in democratic processes and the rights and worth of all individuals. We utilize these processes in the management and action of this circle. And in order to help fulfill some of these purposes, we are a member of both the American Ethical Union, a national group of ethical societies, and we support the International Humanist and Ethical Union. My name is Tom Hefner. I'm the president of the Circle and a founding member of the Circle. My wife, Joanne, and I came to this movement about 1972, and actually a little bit earlier when we discovered it in New York, as Joanne was looking through the back of the Humanist magazine and saw some interesting notion of a title called ethical culture. And we got involved in a variety of ways because it was intellectually stimulating and socially engaging, and it was meaningful for our family and the community that we felt very much a part of. Having grown up Roman Catholic and my wife Protestant, that had a religious core, but it had less meaning as time went on for us in terms of understanding the nature of the world. It gave us some perspective of the world beyond us, but in fact, not very much insight to the world around us. And since we were both in psychology, we thought that something about human behavior was something that had to be taken into account in however this world was going to be understood. And that's where we began, by watching how people behave and interact, and looking for ways of bringing out more positive interactions within ourselves, between ourselves, with our connections of other people. And we happen to be getting to know each other in the world in that particular time as the Vietnam War was just getting boiling, and it gave us a little focus for our thoughts. In any case, we moved into the States and became involved in the ethical culture movement, and it has been a very rewarding experience, both the people, ideas we've engaged with, but I can't say that we're done. We're very much appreciative of being open to ideas. It's one of the things I learned moving away from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had settled everything a long, long time ago. There were not a lot of new ideas that were coming in, even though the world seemed to be evolving in interesting ways, evolution being a piece of it. We continue to see that we need other ways of resolving the major issues in the world, because every place we look, whether it's in our neighborhood or another mile away or 1,000 miles away, there are clearly unresolved issues, and we're not impressed that we have made very much progress on some of those. We look today to our friend Ron Baiman. In addition to being a founding member of the Democratic Socialists of America, he's a professor of economics at Benedictine University, an Ethical Humanist Circle member. He and his wife, Michelle, are parents of Jeremy, Rachel, and Rebecca. He has a PhD in economics from New School, a New York school, I believe, where I grew up in New York. So I carry a little bit with me of those things that he might have been exposed to, and he's elaborated on those. His most recent books are The Morality of Radical Economics and The Global Free Trade Era. Ron will speak to us on democratic socialism. Is there really an alternative? Please welcome Ron. And we'll have lots of opportunity for discussing some of the ideas that he proposes right here.
Yes.
Ron.
Thank you, everyone, for inviting me. I really appreciate this. And my wife, Michelle, who many of you know, sends her regards and love to what we consider to be part of our extended family. Although we live far away, so we don't get up here that often, since our kids are adults right now. And also, let me just, on another personal note, the last time I gave a talk to Ethical Humanist Culture Society was in New Jersey, the Essex Ethical Culture Society. in 1994, beginning of 1994, and it was on this very same topic, and it was actually the day my father died, and it was a very, he asked me, I said, Dad, it was precipitous. I mean, we had no idea that this was going to happen so quickly, but we knew that he was in bad shape, just in the hospital. No, go give the talk, go give the talk. No, he insisted that I go give the talk. And if I'd known that, of course, he was going to die during the talk, I wouldn't have, but that's what happened. So it's a kind of personally a very, it's very affecting, very important moment for me, and it's a pleasure to be able to do that again in my dad's honor. Memory. I will dedicate this talk to him. Okay, so I've been a Democratic Socialist for, actually there was a Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee before DSA was founded in 1981. DSA is the Democratic Socialists of America, which is has expanded enormously in the last few years beyond our wildest dreams, and this is sort of what we dreamed of, which carries with it its own issue. For some of us older members, the kids are taking over and they're doing everything wrong. But before, so there was DSOC before that. Michael Harrington, some of you may remember, was the leader of both groups for many years until he died. And then before that, I was in the New American Movement, which is an outgrowth of the New Left. I was out on the West Coast, in Berkeley, actually. A long story, but so I've been part of this movement in various forms for many years, and I think we're beginning, as I sort of I encounter my students today and compare them to the students I had even 10 or 20 years ago. I think there's a real awakening, and it's very, very encouraging among the young people. Young people realize that this system is just not working. It's really oppressing the lives of particularly younger people, and they feel it, and they're very, very open to more fundamental critiques. So there's something wrong with this. It's just not working for us or for people in general, or for our country, or for the world. So this is what I want to talk about. But let me start with, as many of you know, I'm sort of prone to kind of a little bit kind of abstract thinking. I will try to supplement with anecdotes, but let's start with some principles. So and think about what democracy means, because I think basically what we're talking about, democratic socialism, is democracy. It's just extending democracy to the economy. There was an unfinished project in the Enlightenment. We got formal political economy, formal political democracy, more or less, depending on the country and the society. But there were major progress towards that. We undermined the notion that a divine ruler or inherited power is acceptable. And of course, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and we forget the French were pivotal in making our revolution work. Through those movements, we developed a broad-based concept of political democracy that has since become sort of the norm, or at least the standard or the goal around the world. And for a long time, the U.S. was one of the leaders of that, or at times, let's say, but at least in terms of lip service, that probably changed in the last few years, but we won't get into that right now. So political democracy. So the standard that we're sort of the U.S. Constitution, many of the constitutions that are around the world, is formal liberal democracy. So that means multiple parties, free and fair elections, freedom of association and speech, independent judiciary. I didn't put that in here, but that's very important. Equality under the law, civil liberties to prevent tyranny of the majority. So that's one of the innovations the US Constitution is particularly famous for the civil rights, the civil liberties bill, that idea that you need to preserve the rights of the minority so that the majority doesn't just trample over them and end democracy. Because democracy is based on a continued discussion. You have to allow people to have the power and the wherewithal and the ability to debate and discuss things, and if the majority just tramples the opposing side, well, that's the end of discussion, no more democracy. So that was very critical. And a lot of this, though, comes out of the liberal tradition of negative liberty. That is, you want to limit the coercive power of the state, and that's the historical background of this. I'm probably repeating things that many of you know, but you just have to bear with me till we get to the discussion section. It was the revolt of the nobles in England, the Magna Carta, and against the king, and so there was this the notion, and of course the classical political economy is largely focused on getting rid of the privileges of the crown, the sort of the tyranny of the state. So we want to open up. They were advocates for the rising industrial capitalist system in England, and they were very much focused on opening up the market, not allowing all these special privileges, special charters, special monopolies, and it was very much focused on the coercive and repressive power of the state. And so it limits individual coercion, and also of other individuals later on, like slavery and feudalism were abolished. In France, it was actually Napoleon. Well, the French Revolution and Napoleon kind of spread it throughout much of Europe, Western Europe especially. And part of this, and this has developed into sort of the dominant ideology that we live under. It's the basis for the American Constitution as well. So there's a strict divide between, in this system, between the public sector subject to democratic accountability and the private sector subject to market accountability. So inherent to this system, this notion, there's the political sphere, the public sphere, the state that controls, has a monopoly on force, is the way I think they frame it in standard political science. The state has the power of violent, actual power of military power, police power, and that's where democratic accountability is really important, and the right to vote, and the leaders that represent the people that vote them into office, et cetera, accountable to them. The private sector is a whole different story. The private sector is ruled by equal exchanges, by the market system, and the market is what provides accountability. In the private sector, there's no real power in this way of thinking in the private sector. That is, the CEO might look like a CEO has a lot of power, but the CEO is just reacting to market forces, just trying to make money. They're all just trying to make profit. They're not actually exercising power, personal power or social power over society, over other people. You can see that I think that this is, for most of us, what are you talking about? This is, ownership is power, as I think Hobbes or some of the people, were very forthright about that. But in this theory, no. So, and there's a lot more about that. And, if you look at the Bowles and Guinness have a great book, a very old book, and they go into this very eloquently that I cite in my book as well. Okay, so that's political democracy. Then there's social democracy, and that's more common. We point to Western Europe, the countries of Western Europe, particularly Northern Europe, even Germany, France. What are the French rebellion? In the U.S. press, it's all about the gas tax. It's not really what they're rebelling against is neoliberalism. Macron cut the wealth tax. Wealth is one of I think maybe the only advanced country in the world that has a tax on wealth. It's not just real estate, but financial wealth. And he said, no, we got to eliminate that tax on investment, and we got to privatize the railroads. I mean, all these things he's doing that follow the neoliberal agenda, the capitalist agenda, and he's masking it in the frame of I want to do something about global climate change, and so that's the hypocrisy of this is what at least many of them, that was sort of the underlying basis of this rebellion. Although it's true that the gas tax was sort of one of the torches that lit the flame here. But the French are doing it again, and good for them, because we need that kind of uprising against that ideology. So social democracy is substantive liberal democracy. It's having a very large public sector. In many of those countries, up to 50% or even more is outside the market. It's funded by public funding. Very progressive taxes, high taxes, fund a very generous public sector that includes, healthcare, education, childcare. France is one of the best in the world. Preschool, public preschool, and retraining job programs. I mean, just elder care, and as well as generous vacation supports for women. I mean, almost every social indicator, the countries in Northern Europe come out on top. You name it: democracy, feminism, support for developing countries. They are usually at the very top of other countries. And part of the thinking here is that in order to have a real democracy, you have to have not just negative liberty, but positive liberty. What does positive liberty means? It means relative equality of access to resources that enable participation in civil society and the liberal democratic state. So it's not enough just to have the formal right to vote and, let's say, formal equality under the law, but you also have to have resources. You have to have, in a modern society, you can't really participate unless you have some degree of economic security, some level of education. Of course, you have to be healthy. All these things are essential to being able to actually participate in society. And so the social democracies recognize that. So it's not enough just to have legal equality. You've got to have substantive, some kind of real ability to have a substantive participation in society. Okay, finally we get to economic democracy. By the way, these blue things are links to references for these things if any of you want to download this PowerPoint later on. So what is socialist democracy? Here the recognition here is the need for democratic liberty. So not just, let's say, formal political equality vis-a-vis the state, or even access to resources to participate in that, but also in our daily lives, a fundamental principle of democracy is that we have the right to equal power over decisions to the degree that we are affected by them. It should not disappear at the corporate door. It used to be the factory gate, but wherever it is, in our society, when we move into the private sector, quote unquote, all our civil liberties, our civil rights, our democratic rights, everything disappears. Boom. We're turned into basically hired labor. We're not quite slaves. We can leave, we can quit and try and look for a job elsewhere. So there's, you might call it class slavery, but there's not, we're not tied to the employer in the way that a slave is. We're not owned by somebody. But our work, our lives are tyrannically controlled by the owners, by the investors, who are actually the agents, usually the managers, the top managers and their agents, who will direct us to work for them to serve their interests that are not our interests. They're not even pretending to be managing or coordinating in the interest of the workers. They're right now. I mean, I teach in a business school and I rail against this all the time with my students. But the ideology is creating stockholder value. I think it's destroying our economy. It's absolutely destroying our economy. Stock buybacks don't do anything for anybody except generate wealth for CEOs, huge paybacks. But that's the ideology. They say no. You should have a concept of stewardship. When you're a manager, you're stewarding a social institution. It's not really private at all. Especially if it's a large country, those decisions affect lots of people, not just the private interests of an owner or even of the putative investors, or even of the large investors, are the ones that really have some power over things. They're not the ones that you should be serving, certainly not exclusively. They're just one of the stakeholders. That's sort of, this should be democratized. So in an economic democracy, we realize that in a modern developed society, it's not enough to not go to jail, have the coercive power of the state just kind of lock you up. And, negative liberty is, of course, very important, essential, but it's not adequate. Social, what did I call that other one? A positive liberty is also very essential. You have to have resources. You have to have access to resources. You also have to be able to work in society. You have to be able to have power over social decisions that affect you in every dimension, not just by the state, but also by your company, by your corporation, by whatever institutions you work for. You should have, to the extent that they significantly affect you, you should have the ability to have an equal say over those decisions. That's what democracy is all about. Now, there are, of course, many practical questions here. There are some things the market is much more efficient and better if it's controlled by society. But by and large, certainly for large corporations, we need to have economic democracy, corporate democracy. And that agenda, by the way, again, in Western Europe, there's the co-determination in Germany that's being rolled out throughout Europe. There's in large companies, 50% of the board have to represent the workers. In smaller companies, it's a smaller share. And there's I think Elizabeth Warren has a bill in the U.S. to do a similar, make that, but she says, this is just crazy, what's going on here. We have the leaders of our society, and increasingly, that have, right now are basically controlling entire political parties. The Republican Party, I think, are basically just shills for billionaires, and they made it quite obvious, and a good part of the Democratic Party as well. So it's not just economic power, but it translates directly to political power, having that huge amount of just wealth, just being able to control all these human beings, and access to all this ability to control society. Here's Rosa Luxemburg, one of my favorite quotes. She was a left social democrat in Germany, before the First World War. The Social Democrats were the largest, most powerful workers' party alliance in Western Europe. Marx worked with them, very closely, and most Marxists believed he thought that's where the revolution was going to come. It's coming in the advanced countries, especially in Germany, countries where they had large worker movements that had already had enormous success. So they had, they put it in healthcare. Bismarck put it in back in the 19th century, universal healthcare, all these things. And anyway, Rosa Luxemburg was part of the SDP, but she broke with them over, well, particularly World War I, but because they ended up supporting the German state in World War I, which, to their eternal shame. The Great Imperialist War, the first one. The second one was, over other things as well. But anyway, she was advocating a kind of workers, more of a democratic socialist revolution. He said, "We have always distinguished the social content of the political shape of the bourgeois democracy. We always knew how to disclose the bitter seed of the inequality of the social subjugation that hides inside the sweet shell of equality and of formal freedom. Not to reject them, but to incite the working class not to attain just to the package, to conquer political power, to fill it with a new social content. The historical mission of the proletariat, once the power is gained, is to create, instead of the bourgeois democracy, a socialist democracy, and not to abolish all democracy." I should say she was very critical of Lenin as well, as she early on saw the tendency toward a totalitarian, toward an undemocratic tendency in those revolutions. Okay. So now I just have a few more slides, and I know, the discussion, probably a lot of you have thoughts and ideas about this topic, but I just have a few more. Democratic Socialism and Ethical Humanism. So I said the economy is not a private sector, a realm of free and voluntary exchange. That's economic ideology. That's what my book is about, that basically, that what we teach in 99.9% of economics departments, the US and around the world, for the most part, is is an ideology. It's capitalist ideology. Just like in the old Soviet Union, they used to teach this sort of Soviet version of Marxism, it's the science of Marxism. It's state legitimation ideology. It's not a science at all. And so we teach that in high school and college. I mean, it's a large enterprise of propaganda, and it's wrong. And even some of the our famous liberal progressive philosophers like John Rawls, they're wrong. I mean, they think that, Rawls famously was ambiguous about capitalism. He said, it does not violate what he called the liberty principle of maximum individual liberty consistent with equal liberty for all. It does. It absolutely does, because, let's go to Kant right away, who said it does not violate the second categorical imperative to treat people as ends, not means. What does capitalism do? That's exactly what it does. It treats workers as means to make profit. That has nothing to do with human dignity. It's not recognizing the self, the individual, people as people, their agency, their right to have decision, to have powers over things that affect them. It's just the opposite of that. It's a class system of exploitation and and generating profit. So on both of those famous philosophers were actually off on this. They didn't recognize what capitalism really is. I mean, I think Rawls may have kind of a naive view of markets, being some kind of supermarket, realm of free exchange and equality. And we all know that their capitalism has a very large vertical dimension, the class dimension, that has nothing to do with equality. It's all about power, basically, and class power in particular. So rather than trying to derive morality from a religious or philosophical system, because I think what happens is that philosophers will come up with a system, let's say, contract theory, the original contractual situation, it goes all the way back to, I think, John Locke, and down to Rawls is kind of a version of that, social contract theory. And you devise this system and then you show that it produces good results. It produces a morality that makes sense. Or of course, religious morality, where it's all divinely, comes from the heavens or from God or from divine source. It's kind of this absolute morality that falls from the sky, so to speak. In either case, I would tend to agree with Sam Harris. Some of you may know him. He's an atheist philosopher. I would call him an ethical humanist, although I don't know if he's a member of it. He wrote a book on, point out, one of his books, that morality, human well-being is based on human empathy, sort of like where Tom started in his preamble. It's human empathy, and like human health, evolves over time and increasingly should be informed scientifically by evidence and reason. Makes sense, right? Double a typo there. But so the idea here is that, morality is not some absolute thing. And it comes from empathy. Actually, both Adam Smith and David Hume and some of the empiricists, the philosophical. Adam Smith was Scottish Enlightenment. Smith was very influenced by Hume, who, by the way, was also an atheist. They wouldn't even bury him in the cemetery because he had renounced God, which was a very brave thing to do back in those days. I think he was denied, academic positions and so forth for that. In any case, the notion that Smith has these famous quotes where he says, how many of you would give your right eye to save 1 million people in India? Or, and he's sort of pointing out that, and even as we live today in our capitalist system, I mean, we know that many of the goods and services and, none of us are absolutely moral. We can't. We live in a system where it's impossible. And to the extent that things are farther away, they're not our family, they're not our friends, they're not people we know, then we have less and less interest. It's just natural, it's human. So to the extent that you want to extend that solidarity, and that's the basis for human morality, empathy and solidarity, it starts with the family, I assume, and then goes out. And that's the basis for morality, and you want to support that with reason and evidence. So child development, literature says, corporal punishment is really bad for kids. That's sort of a conclusion of years and years of study. You engage in violent acts against children, even spanking or hitting or whatever, and it's more likely to perpetuate over generations. They will do that to their kids and so forth and so on. But the Bible says don't, some of the Bible, of course, has all kinds of quotes, and people can find almost anything they want in there. But one of the ones, and actually in the U.S. public school system, it's legal in many public school systems in the South still to use corporal punishment because of the Bible says that's how you raise children. So it's just an example of how scientific investigation, like what's good, what's actually good for human well-being, can further enhance moral principles, moral kind of guidance. Okay. I'm probably going to, anyway. Democratic socialism and social choice. So this one, I mentioned that, continuation of the Enlightenment, why stop the economy. So some of you, again, are probably familiar with Hirschman's distinction between voice and exit. The voice is where you have political participation, actual voice. You have meetings, you have votes. Exit is the market. Basically, your vote is to choose someone else. And that's how the market is supposed to be a form of accountability, which it is if everybody has equal power to make other choices, and if they're, and the various providers of the choices have sort of equal access to people's decision on that. Vertical class, I mentioned that. So the notion, and I'm sort of repeating something I said, but maybe embellishing it a little bit more. The notion that market-based individual choices in the economy will only serve the public good if they are through the market is wrong, and rather they are actually embedded and constrained by democratic social choices. So the economy is best viewed as a hierarchy of increasingly less important social choices, with the least important for the overall economy, that's purely individual choices at the very bottom. So yes, what flavor ice cream? What kind of shirt should I wear? That's an individual choice. That will have negligible impact on other people. The aggregation of that will have an impact, but the individual choice won't. But at every other level, when you think about investment decisions, you're thinking about, where to put a convention center, where to make a development. All these things are social choices that affect entire communities, societies, countries. If they're very, GM is going to close all these plants in Michigan and build one in Mexico. Don't get me started on that. That's a social choice that affects thousands of people. In this case, 18,000 people are going to lose their jobs. In auto workers, it's among the best jobs a working class person could get. So those are not individual choices. Those are social choices, and they constrain what happens at the levels below. That is, the factory in the town supports all the local businesses, basically. All the retail, everything else is supported because there's a source of income for the customers to spend at those local businesses. So at every level of the economy, the big choices constrain the smaller choices, and you go down. And that's the best way to be. It's not this flat realm of perfect competition, especially when you have monopolies like Amazon and Facebook and the platform, the dominant platform monopolies, and especially the financial sector that I'll get to in the next one of the. These are dominant sectors, and they make choices that affect the planet, in some cases. So Karl Polanyi is famous after World War II, or I think it was 1944, he came out with that book, The Great Transformation, where he was a major critic of the old liberalism, the pre-war liberalism that had led to the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression. Now we have neoliberalism, same ideology. Let the markets rule. The markets are somehow projected as being void of power. They're sort of a realm of, it's sort of a distorted view of freedom. So no, that's not how it works. The markets should constrain, rather society, social choices should constrain the markets, and the markets should be embedded in society rather than running society. like the Japanese used to say that too as well. Market should serve, not rule. And of course, Asian development programs have very much built along that model. And in our case, of course, we should be constructing a green economy which on a war footing. This is what Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, the DSA, the young DSA congressperson, who's getting enormous amounts of press, which I'm thrilled with, but she's trying to get a select committee for a Green New Deal in the House. And right now, I urge you to call your, I have an action item here. There it is at the bottom here. Call your House member, whoever it is, and urge them to support that. It's not a bill, but they're setting the rules for the new Congress. So she wants to make that a priority. It should be. It's like World War II here. We're for not just, it's planetary survival, it's species survival. I mean, we're up against, we have 12 years to turn this ship. Or something like, a decade or two basically is what they're telling us before it just, and we see the catastrophe right before us, the insects dying, the trees dying. Every time I turn on the radio and I listen to Tom Hartman and people like that, it's just one thing after another that's happening in the world. Okay, and then some practical things. We think of the Northern European countries as capitalists. The leftists in the US think of them as democratic socialists. As capitalists think of them as capitalists, we think of democratic socialists because they have very large public sectors. They're more social democratic probably, but and we do need to recognize that for-profit markets can be a very powerful incentive, but you have to make them serve society. And though even in periods, and many of us are old enough to remember the post-war period before, up till the mid-70s or the 80s, actually Ronald Reagan in the US and Thatcher in England, where things just abruptly changed. Even in those periods, there was increasing equality both in the economy and politically under a capitalist system, but it's just turned around completely. And I think the lesson we've learned is that capitalism, raw capitalism, will rear its ugly head again and again if the economy is not democratized. And I have a proposal here that is fundamentally democratized. We thought we could just kind of regulate the corporations, have a strong government, sort of keep them serving, trying to serve the public good. And what happened was they became so powerful that they basically bought the government. And they're running the government and just subjecting all of us to their agenda. How do you change that? Well, this is, when I was down in Cuba, I think 1996, they practically expelled me, deported me for this, but I was able to give a talk. It's kind of an interesting story. The Cubans couldn't do this, but I was having these private conversations with great people. It's a great, they're really engaged folks down there. And then I just I changed my academic presentation on market socialism to a proposal for democratic reform, and that's, there's a link there for that whole proposal. But basically, you need to have real democracy. We can't have the sacred right of private property, whatever that means, in the Constitution. That's not democracy, because private property is not the right to own your house or your shirt or your car. It's interpreted as your investment property, to own companies, to own the labor of other people, to rent the labor of other people. That's private property, and that's used over and over again to undermine democracy. So I have, and then all these other social rights and free, you have access to media, elections, public election financing, social economic opportunity, that's healthcare, education, etc., cultural environment. All of this should be democratic. And of course, the environment. We should all be, the government is supposed to be a steward of our environment. Right now it's destroying it in our country anyway. So these are all these examples of how in practice capitalism is just fundamentally incompatible with democracy. Orban, there was no jailing of journalists, none of that. He just had his friends and cronies buy up the entire Hungarian media. So now it's just back to communism. It's just Orban. That's all you see. So I think there's just a few outlets in Hungary where you see anything else. And of course, in the U.S., we're not quite that bad, but we're, the fellow named Murdoch was able to buy up most of the Australian media, and the ex-prime minister wrote this piece here a whole piece on this, how Murdoch has been able to destroy politics in Australia. Then he went to the UK, did the same thing. Then he went to the US, and he's on his way to doing that here. Hopefully we can stop it, but it's not just Fox, it's also Sinclair, you know, these stations that don't have the Fox logo on them, so you think they're just your public broadcaster, but they're forced to repeat these editorials that are handed down from above, sort of, you know, supporting migrant detention, supporting this and that. And you don't even know that you're listening to political propaganda, basically. It's your news program, your local news. So it's even more insidious in many ways. And they're buying up all these stations. They bought up all the talk radio and everything else. So we allowed that to happen because the corporations lobbied for a Telecommunications Act that Clinton signed, by the way, that allows for concentrated media, allows for all this stuff to happen. So our politicians got bought out, and then the rest is history now. And the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendments, the corporations can avoid, like we had this lettuce outbreak. Well, you know, they can't search companies because the companies claim that they have the, which one is it? The fourth, the right to, you know, not, search and seizure. The government can't come in. So the government can't inspect a company because a company is a person, and they have a constitutional right to be free of. What kind of? I mean, this is, you know, it's like saying the government can't be subjected to any inspection by the public. Because, I mean, we make it, you know, it's kind of similar thing. It's a social organization. Of course they need to be transparent and inspected and regulated and so forth. None of this stuff should be applying to them. Okay, and then finally, my last slide, I promise. Just to carry this a little bit, and this is something that I'm personally very interested in, as it's, you know, my work. At the political economy level, we're dealing with, in many ways, not just sort of classic Marxism, you know, the class struggle and the conflict between capital and labor and all that entails. So that is very much part of it. But we're back to even a more historically earlier form of domination. Basically, it's rentierism or feudalism, basically. In feudalism, it was the lords that the land. It was all based on land ownership. And this goes back to this guy, Michael Hudson, a radical economist. I urge you to read his books. He's very, very good on this. He's actually an expert on Middle Eastern history, Bronze Age history. He goes all the way back to the Babylonians and the Sumerians, and he brings it up to like even the Jews. You know, in the Talmud, you have these periods of jubilee where you're supposed to cancel all debts. He said, and slavery. You know, free the slaves, cancel the debts. This goes all the way back to Babylonia. That the rulers, it was typically the temples that had the debts. It was easier to do, but they would abolish all debt. They wipe out everything, start with a clean slate, and that's how you rejuvenate civilization. So you don't get this overwhelming power of the rentiers, of the landlords, of the property owners, the owners, the people that are able to extract wealth just by virtue of what they own, or their power in society. Well, we've gone back, you know, in many ways we have our new rentier sector is dominated, it's finance, basically. That's what you know, it's financial wealth that's extracting returns and returns, piling up debts, forcing the Europeans, they have all their apparatchiks, all these Goldman Sachs people running the European Central Bank and the IMF, and you know, everywhere you go, there's these guys from Wall Street kind of running things, and for the interest of the private financiers. So, oh no, you got to bail out all the banks. That's what they did. That's what we did. That's what the Europeans did. You got to bail out the banks and make it public debt, and then the poor Greeks and the poor, you know, all these indebted countries. And us as well, you know, we end up having to pay all this stuff. Although in our case, we were able just to create dollars. So we created trillions and trillions, I think 16 trillion, I forget the figure. But the bailout was enormous. I mean, what they paid back was pennies. On the bailout, those banks all should have gone bankrupt. That debt should have been wiped out. If anybody needed to be bailed out, it should have been the people. The homeowners, people, you know, if you want to revive the economy, that's how you do it. That's what Roosevelt did in the Depression. You don't bail out the banksters and keep all the debt on the books and then force everybody to come up with ways to pay that debt. So we're doing that over and over again. Illinois is another case, you know. The pension debt is sacrosanct. I used to work in state policy, and I wrote this paper saying, well, why don't we get the investors to take a cut? I mean, why do you keep saying the workers have to take a cut? And they all looked at me like I, you know, was some kind of a nutcase, you know. I said, oh, I mean, this is crazy. You know, you're making all of society pay for the leaders. You know, I agree. Politicians kept kicking the thing down the road, and they, you know, and why should the workers have to suffer for this? I mean, they fulfilled their side of the bargain. It's the state that didn't kick in money to the pension funds, and you're not taxing the wealthy. You're not generating the revenue to pay for this. So either you do that, and maybe you can make the bondholders take a cut as well. You know, instead of the workers, that would be much better for society. In fact, that's why we have bankruptcy laws. Well, we used to. We don't have them for student debt anymore, but for many kinds of personal debt. Again, another bankster reform. They made it impossible. Students literally cannot discharge their debt. That's why it's the most secure tranche in a derivative is student debt, because we got these young people. They're basically slaves. They're debt slaves to their student loans. So it's a terrible situation, and that's what, you know, our modern financial rentierism has led us to. So it's in many ways even a worse problem, a more fundamental problem than just straight industrial capitalist class struggle. Because at least the capitalists used to invest in factories and produce jobs, even if they exploited the workers. There was some progress in terms of the capacity of society to produce resources to benefit humanity. In this case, it's just looting, basically. They're finding ways to just, you know, they're buying, you know, just enrich themselves and not producing real value for anybody, just wealth for themselves. So we're in a kind of a more dire situation of unequal exchange. And if any of you are interested in that, there's some papers as well on that, and I would urge you to read Michael Hudson is really good on that. So that's where I will finish.
Thank you, Ron. Now, we'll have time for questions and answers, but first, we'll have a musical selection from Ron's oldest daughter, Rachel, who a number of you may have heard perform. Many of you have known her since childhood, small. And while we'll listen, we'll pass a basket for anybody who wants to make a voluntary contribution this week to buy gift cards for a family in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood of Chicago's Southwest Side. There's a widower and children, daughters age 5 and 15, and we're going to help them to have a little bit better holiday. So if you'd like to contribute to that, you're invited to do that and think up your good questions, and then Ron will try to fend them off and put us in the right direction. So it's coming.
Wrong song.
She's got a lot of good songs.
Wrong song. Yeah.
65 meets 24 and you pass that corridor, there's Tennessee. Down the street, south of noons, in a flannel shirt, and my busted up shoes, I gotta stay busy. At the end of the day, I'm walking home with a few more dollars to call my own back to Tennessee. Ripped up seams and rain on sheets and a ragged old mattress and a roof that leaks, well, it ain't too pretty. Ain't too pretty, that old Tennessee, that's where
tent city from her latest EP.
I think she's
Mentioned
living in
in
Nashville
Billboard.
as we speak, is that right?
That's correct.
Wonderful. Could I bring you back up to the podium? And if you have questions, please send them forward. And Ron, I'll ask you to repeat them so that it goes into the mic. Sure. So,
But please state them loudly, because I may not hear you.
I'll help yes, please.
I don't know if this is so much a question. I guess I'm a little bit disappointed in that in your presentation you didn't actually address how socialism would be good. I mean, I find that it has its own problems and bigger than the problems that you've discussed here. Yeah.
Okay, so you're asking me to address why socialism would be good, and maybe it sounds like you have some concerns that socialism would not be so good. I think the evidence for the kind of socialism that I'm talking about, democratic socialism, the Western European variety, is pretty clear. I mean, I don't even, if you look at any indicator, for the broad population, the countries in Western Europe, I mean, Denmark, they're consistently the happiest country in the world. Why are they so happy? They have very high incomes, they have long vacations, they have childcare, healthcare, elder care. I mean, all the problems that we struggle with, they seem to have, I've never been there, I'm sure there are problems. There's problems with immigrants and things like that. Social problems and other problems, I'm sure, because they're very homogeneous. And, but in terms of economic and political democratic problems, they seem to be a much better, more democratic and ability to provide resources to the broad base of the population in a way that we are unable to, that more capitalist countries like the US and the UK are unable to. So I think that's, and of course, I think if we talk to leftists in Denmark or Northern Europe or wherever, they would always say, yeah, but we need more, or we have, in Sweden they tried to enact a system where the stock would be actually transferred to collective ownership. It's called the Meidner Plan. It was in the 1980s, and it was vociferously opposed by the capitalist class, the owners, because they had concentrated ownership in Sweden, and some of the big families, the Wahlbergs, whatever, own large shares. And they, it's gulag, communism, you're bringing us back to Stalin. And anyway, so it brought down the Social Democratic Party in Sweden. They enacted a watered down version of that, so they have, I think, 25%. Some share of stock is owned by these collective funds. But it would have had actually transfer of ownership to, it would have socialized the ownership in Sweden if that had gone through eventually. I could go into that, but so they would themselves say, no, we're not democratic socialists. We're on the way. We're certainly better than the U.S. and the UK, but we're not there yet, and we still have this, the feudal corporate system, the top-down hierarchy in corporations. Even with some shared workers on the board, there's a lot that needs to be done there in terms of making those workplaces more democratic.
But presumably you're speaking about other countries than Western European countries.
I guess I should.
Other examples of socialism.
I kind of have a big question, comment. I guess I wanted you to clarify what you mean by socialism. Do you mean actually the government controlling the means of production, or do you just mean having more programs that distribute wealth, but not really controlling the industries?
Well, I think that's
So the question is it a matter that Ron's arguing for, is the government controlling the means of production, or just a different level of distribution of goods to the population?
Yeah, I think that may be the source of this. Some of the our perspective, different viewpoints on this. In my view, it does not mean state ownership and control of the means of production, if that's what you mean by government. If you mean, in many, it could be co-ops, nonprofits, you're socializing the means of production, which does not mean centralized government control and ownership. Now, there's some major sectors, and like Social Security, I think, healthcare, healthcare insurance certainly is much more efficient when it's done as a universal system. So pensions, some systems work much better when they're universal controlled, and so then you would probably have some kind of public, government role in that. But other systems, like, running steel mills or whatever, the market has a role to play, and it's useful to allow openings for entrepreneurs and competition and so forth within, controlled and guided by society. And worker co-ops. I mean, in Madison, Wisconsin, they have one of the, they have a co-op of home care workers, and one of the largest in the country. The Mondragon is famous in Spain, the Basque region. It's a giant multinational company. It makes ships. It makes computer controlled. I mean, it's the leading high-tech sector in Spain. They have an engineering college. It's the leading, it's like the MIT of Spain. And that's hundreds of thousands, 130,000, I think, cooperative members run that. They elect, they vote. They have a board of representative workers who hire managers. So the managers have managerial authority while they're in their position, but they're reviewed by this board of workers. So, and their goals are set by the workers. And there's no investors. There's no stock owners. It's all, they have their own banking system, actually, their own banking system to fund a lot of their stuff. And so it's been hugely successful, even though Spain has gone through some really hard times. And they've had to actually close down one of their leading co-ops, but almost all the workers got placed in other co-ops. I mean, they're very, the co-op it runs in the interest of the workers and the community, because they have a large influence in the Basque region, of course, in Basque culture, and so they're very supportive of the community. It does not run for absentee investors, which is the way a capitalist corporation works. But you've got to cut me off, because I'll start rambling on every question.
Yes, Sid.
Right now, you have 3 corporations that control half the wealth of the planet. Bezos, Buffett, and Gates. They own half of the wealth of the whole planet. And monopolies are inherent in capitalism. You can't do away with it in capitalism. So that's what controls our country. It's an oligarchy. That's what we have now.
So that's so your question is a role, I would say.
It's not a question.
You're asking, so Sid is just making comment that we currently have an oligarchy with a few companies and a few people controlling enormous wealth.
Yeah, and I would agree, but there is, I absolutely agree, and that's one of the, the issues with rentierism, because, Buffett, he's a financial, investor, and Facebook has enormous power. I mean, you can see the problem with Facebook is it's a private company. It's only care about its profit. So, if it runs roughshod over civil liberties or whatever, I mean, I don't know, individually they might have some concern about that, but in terms of the company algorithms and so forth and so on, and I don't know that Sheryl Sandberg, going after opponents of Facebook on Facebook, I mean, it's just total abuse of power. That's just, beyond the pale in terms of any kind of democratic norms or, even market behavior norms. But in terms of, we used to have antitrust that did break up some of those, like we broke up Standard Oil, we broke up, to AT&T. Back in the days, it stopped actually under Reagan, I believe. I forget the date exactly, but we basically haven't been, very little antitrust. It's only we go after our enemies. That's what Trump is doing. So there are even, but again, it's because our government has been taken over, bought by these very powerful companies and their investors. That our government no longer works for us. So they're not going to bust up these obvious monopolies and predatory monopolies, as you point out. Yes,
Please. Yes,
Yeah.
This way and then this way.
Okay, I'll grant you that it is very unnerving when you go to talk with your banker about taking out more than $1,000. They actually want you to play Mother May I and let them know. Okay, I'll grant you that it's very unnerving when you talk with your banker, someone working at the bank, about withdrawing more than $1,000 from your own checking account. This is your money, supposedly, but legally they see it as their own. There's something wrong with that. However, I'd like to know why you call it democratized when the only so-called democracy left in the world, from my point of view, is a capitalist country? Why do you say democratize this country, democratize that country? These countries are, for the most part, already socialist, if not communist. And one secondary part of that question is, why are people coming up to the U.S. from Central and South America if socialist democracies are such a good thing?
So I think your question is, why am I?
Want me to repeat it? It's kind of
I-
long.
Sure, you go.
I think so. Why am I calling for more democracy
You
for
say
countries
democratizing countries.
that are in your question the most democratic countries in the world already, or they are democratic already?
From my point of view, there's only one country that's still democracy, and that's this country.
Okay, so
It's a real stretch to call it a democracy, I'll admit.
Okay.
However, it is a capitalist democracy, and so when you say that you are talking about democratizing these countries, I'm thinking to myself, I have to say it, that you really mean socialize these countries.
So you're saying the U.S. is the only democratic country in the world, and when I call
Well,
for
it's a big stretch.
Okay,
I'll grant you,
or
it's a
the
huge
most
stretch.
democratic
It's-
country
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
world.
it's a huge stretch.
And when I call for democratizing, I'm calling for socializing, or
Yeah.
some kind of
It-
socialization. And then
Right.
the other question was about the Central American immigrants.
Right.
So I think you're factually in error. I think in terms of if you look at any of the the people that study degrees of democracy among countries, the U.S. is actually way down the list in terms of there are many advanced countries that are more democratic by many measures. They have
Such as
their
Iceland.
electoral system is not so corrupted by money. They have more the lower income and women and other folks participating, and more legislators. And so I think that's just erroneous to think of the U.S. as the most democratic. I
Can
think
you
we're
name
actually,
some- can you
we have a
name some
lot,
things?
He's racing the
Yeah.
Western European countries
Yeah,
as
yeah.
a better model.
yeah, they're more
Yeah.
democratic by all these indicators. But I would urge you to go research that. I think you'd find that, civil rights. I mean, we incarcerate, I think we have the highest share of incarceration in the world. And our incarceration system is not very humane. I mean, actually, if you look at Western Europe, they try and rehabilitate offenders. I mean, they view incarceration as therapy. And we just throw people in jail, mentally ill people, whoever, and most often black men. It's a form of oppression.
No, I see
And
that.
it's a terrible blight on our society that we end up incarcerating. What is it now? I don't know how many millions, but it's more than China.
Why are
More
people
than,
coming-
I
why
don't
are they
know, in
coming
Saudi
in
Arabia,
from
they
France?
execute people, so I mean, but we're just not. So that's one, and then on the Central American, I mean, these are people coming to apply for asylum, which is an international right that we've signed the international treaties to guarantee people that are fighting, escaping
Socialism.
brutal torture, oppression of various kinds in their countries, can come to apply for asylum in other countries. And largely what's happened in Honduras, notice you don't find too many people coming from Costa Rica.
No.
No, why? Because they're a social democratic country
Well,
that
they're
has
more capitalist.
healthcare, education, everything else.
Yeah. They have the
Even
American
Nicaragua,
dollar.
that has its problems now with Ortega becoming kind of a dictator, but even they're not even coming to Nicaragua. They have a sort of they have not been totally
They're under
run
the US
over
dollar.
by the oligarchs. Okay, but it's Honduras that we sanctioned under Obama. There was a coup basically. The governor there ousted the Democratic president, and now it's just gangs and violence and very little opportunity there. Same thing for El Salvador. All these countries were countries we have messed with.
No, they're socialist
We have used our
countries.
big
They're
gringo
communist or
footprint.
socialist countries.
Well, and so
That's
I
what they
think a
are.
lot of what's going on is those are failed states that we're seeing increasingly around the world, by the way. And some of it is even climate change, Syria, Libya.
But they're
And
coming
all
from
over the world,
socialism.
failed states, failed civilization, people can't live. And they're literally being brutalized and tortured, their kids are being murdered by gangs, et cetera, et cetera.
This is
So
communism.
they're trying to find a better life, which are frankly, all of our, I don't think any of us are Native Americans or, our parents and grandparents, and, they came here for the same reason, basically, so, or they were dragged here as slaves. Yeah.
Isn't immigration a stumbling block in Western Europe, given like Merkel is facing right now in her popularity in Germany because she's admitted has so many immigrants? Is not this changing? Hasn't Europe itself, the Western Europe socialism that you are praising, is it not under assault now? And is it likely to continue given these pressures? And even in the United States, what we're doing in terms of immigration. This is becoming the big issue now. And I don't think a lot of people are moving from Latin America because they're being tortured or whatever. I think they're moving because of lack of economic possibilities, even sustenance. So they think they can feed themselves if they can get across the border.
So the question is immigration undermining the Western, whatever the governments are in Western Europe?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and undeniably, it's causing enormous political conflict and pressure in many countries. And I think, you know, actually, the Green Party is doing really well in Germany as well. In fact, in Bavaria, one of the most conservative states, they got into government and running on explicitly pro-immigration. You know, all of us are Germans. We need to welcome new people. But of course, I think, and even the Yellow Jackets in France. So it's been portrayed in the U.S. media. Oh, they don't like the gas tax. It's actually much deeper than that. Okay, Macron, I think I mentioned that. He eliminated the wealth tax on investment. He wants to privatize rail. I mean, he has a neoliberal economic agenda that he's covering up with this pro-environmental notion. And the gas tax, of course, does really hurt people in rural areas. So you need a way to offset that if you're going to do that in a progressive way. So the same thing with immigration. We obviously, I actually have this debate with some of my fellow leftists. We need an immigration party. It's just not possible. I mean, one of the achievements of developed societies is to develop systems, social systems that allow for democracy. Democracy is actually really fragile. It's really hard, and it's particularly hard to sustain. Any of you who tried to, work in DSA or any kind of, democratic organization, ethical culture society. I mean, it's hard. It's very contentious. It's difficult, and it's very hard to preserve. So countries that have been able to develop these institutions and a democratic culture, and I would point to Northern Europe as the best example of this. It is important to preserve that and not have that overrun or overwhelmed by, because there are problems where there are enormous problems and they're going to get worse as climate change affects more and more countries and more and more people and these kind of, mass failed states all over the place. So we need to have humane immigration policy. We need to, maximal, whatever the country can tolerate economically and socially without destroying the system should be the goal. And actually, I would say I think Sweden had very generous immigration, up until fairly recently. Small country, they were allowing enormous amounts of immigrants relative to us. We have a large country and have a lot more resources than many of those countries in Northern Europe.
They finally had it.
Yeah, they've had to. But so I think you're right. It's a political problem. The way to address that is real economic democracy, real populism opposed to fake populism, which tends to blame the immigrants, blame the foreigners. They're why you're not getting wage increases. They're why the government's cutting pensions and doing all this stuff because those foreigners are coming in and exploiting the system and getting benefits and taking your jobs and so forth and so on. Hartman actually has I think, and I agree with him, that, if we, it was actually under, it turns out, Reagan again, he had, anyway, it was in that period, he had some friends in the meatpacking construction industry, and he agreed to not enforce the immigration laws. So it used to be that employers that hired undocumented workers would get fined, would get penalized. That stopped, completely stopped, and it has not been enforced ever since. That was in like 1986 or something like that. So, in a way to change this a little bit at least would be to start blaming the employers instead of, because they go down to northern Mexico, they advertise, come to the meat packing, get a good job, and they have people, they're actually, people go down there, recruit workers. And the agriculture industry, I think it was agriculture actually, and meat packing, but of course construction also benefited enormously from this. So you've got to, every country in the world, if you go to Australia, anywhere else, you're not an Australian citizen, it's very hard to get a job. And so, and I'm not trying to, they have a racist immigration long-standing program as well, but we need to find a way to address this in a humane and sustainable way that will not, that will again develop society in the world, develop democratic governance in the world. And one of the key things, of course, is actually supporting democratic governments in Latin America and elsewhere, because that was our fundamental mistake. We went in there and destroyed all that. Guatemala, the whole history of our bans, all these, even in Iran, et cetera, where we just undermined democratic transition and propped up these kind of oligarch dictators that have just been a disaster for those countries. And now we're getting the blowback from that. Iraq, anyway, please.
Ron.
Yes.
Hi. I was interested in what you said at the beginning about how the older Democratic Socialists a little bit looked askance at the younger ones, and I'm kind of, in some regards, I'm curious to know about those particular regards.
Well, this is kind of, it's sort of dirty laundry, but I mean, it's in the press. It's not it's not a secret. But when and I've been, I founded, I was a member, I was a member, of DSOC and then DSA, but I haven't really been that involved at the national level in particular. I was on the national, they call it political committee for a short period back in the days when we were trying to find people to do that. It wasn't. But since the enormous upsurge in membership, there was a case, for example, of a fellow from Texas. He was a labor organizer, a great organizer. The Austin chapter of Texas, kind of tripled or quadrupled, or he was a very good leader. And then he ran for the convention in Chicago for the National Political Committee, and he got elected. And then it's the young people with their social media, right? So Twitter, whatnot. He fought for the cops. Plus, he part of his organizing. I think it was prison guards actually. Jeremy was organizing prison guards too. They're workers. A lot of them are racist and whatnot, but they're workers. So you try and bring them into a more solidarity. You've got to work with your black members and others. If you want to get a wage increase or improve conditions here, you've got to work together. But anyway, so he was basically, and they claimed that he had hidden his history of working for I think it was the police union or the prison guards. And it's not true. It was, you could easily find that. He just hadn't highlighted that when he ran. He worked for a lot of organizing companies with a long history, years and years of organizing. And so they basically sort of, in a way, through social media, kind of made it so impossible for him. Even though the NPC, they had an investigation and whatnot, they ruled that it was fine. He was elected, he should serve. But he, at that point, was so scarred by all this, fighting with all these people, calling him, cop, yeah, and that he resigned from DSA. So we've had these kind of things where we've had to, in the past it's all been very collegial, and now it's a large organization. There's all these caucuses. I'm in the North Star caucus. We're sort of the, many of the, Israel has been an issue also, that the divestment issue that many of us oppose. Said no, we want to support the Palestinians, but we also want to support Israel's right to exist. And what you're doing is not doing that, and that's a problem. And that became a problem in Illinois, right, with Daniel Biss, that we ended up supporting. I thought he was still the best candidate, but so there are all these kinds of issues where and back in the days when we were in the 60s, we were causing heartburn for all the old leftists as well, probably.
Yeah, I'm sure we.
Anti-Vietnam War.
Please, yes, please.
Ron, I'm thinking it might be interesting, at least for me, if you could compare more countries on your spectrum of socialism, democracy, capitalism? For example, where would Israel fit on this perspective? Where would China fit? Where would Russia fit?
Yeah, so Israel, when I actually spent 7 years, I went to college in Israel, undergrad and high school as well. And at that point, it was the Labor Party was in control. So certainly for Jews, it was a social democratic country. I mean, the Histadrut, it was the centralized union federation of workers, ran the bus company. They had all these co-op. The bus company was a co-op. They had, Histadrut, and they had enormous power in the government. They had all these businesses, and it was sort of a giant social sector. It wasn't government. It was kind of quasi-government. Histadrut and other institutions, very much like in Europe. You have these large sort of social organizations. Some of the countries, I think Germany is more of that model. And their social democratic policy. However, and even for the Muslim citizens of Israel and the Christian citizens of Israel, there were. I mean, I won't say there was equal treatment, because there was bias in terms of certainly immigration. I mean, if you were Jewish, you could get right away citizenship, and you'd get all kinds of help from the World Jewish Agency. If you're not Jewish, you don't get that help. You have to go through whatever it is and in terms of actual, on the ground investment in new housing and education and so forth, the Arab regions of Israel were underdeveloped. They were like, the poor and minority regions in the U.S. in many ways. So it wasn't perfect by any means. But I had friends in high school. I was in boarding school. We had Arab friends, and we were all fine. I mean, there was no tension or anything. And the curriculum was very much labor. It was socialist curriculum. It was the importance of labor, because the origins, the pioneers of Israel were actually labor Zionists. The kibbutzim and all that. I mean, they were really into this stuff. I mean, they were the sort of, I guess, the Kautsky. Anyway, and there were all these different kibbutz federations of different left movements that were having debates and so forth. It was a very vibrant kind of left culture. That's all changed. I mean, I've been back a couple of times. It's very much dominated by the conservative nationalist, jingoist, reactionary, and also in terms of the economy, it's become hyper. They have the Israeli millionaires, a huge polarization of wealth and income, and part of the rebellion against the right wing is that people are suffering, and of course they're also giving all these benefits to the ultra-religious faction that's grown enormously. They have a huge fertility rate. Part of the, one of the problems with traditional religions, like, just have kids, make more Catholics, make more Jews, the planet can't sustain all this, and then if they're all being supported because they were set up kind of as a museum, like Ben Gurion said, okay, we'll have these Hasis, they were kind of the remnants of the ghettos of Europe, they were all murdered except for these few, and some of them had, long been in Jerusalem and Sfat and some of the holy cities in Israel. And so they gave them benefit. Okay, the men have to study at the synagogue, that's okay, we'll give you welfare benefits and blah, blah, blah. So that has become a huge problem because they're the balance of power. But so things have changed enormously. I would not call it, I would call it more like an American UK system and very, nationalist and jingoist and just, just oppressive society right now, particularly vis-a-vis the Palestinians. I mean, it's very clear.
I want to get one last question, and then it can be discussion afterwards, but not for the whole group.
No.
Yeah. Very good material.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ron, you were talking about the level of how corporates are bad. What about this movement towards the benefit corporation? Don't they work with the BSA?
Question of movement towards benefit corporations.
So
what, can you
they're
explain
certified
what
B
you mean?
corporations.
What are B corporations?
Well, they're supposedly corporations that have gone voluntarily through a long, lengthy program to certify themselves as environmentally, and they work with workers, owners, and it says about almost 3,000 companies in the world, and 60 companies that are merging. Seventh Generation is one of them. Eileen Fisher, that sheet company in Vermont. This is in Vermont. It's probably very heavy in Vermont.
Yeah. So I don't know specifically that example, but of course, any movement in the direction of more responsible management. I mean, I teach in a business program, so so more responsible management, more concern for the environment, more concern for the, right. And I think where when I said, all this enlightened management, employee participation is great. It's definitely an improvement over the alternative. But at the end of the, you really need to share power at some level. And so, you can have all these, it's kind of like having an enlightened boss. A good guy, a good person, takes care of me. It's kind of a paternalistic system where if you have a nice patron, then your life is pretty good. But you're still not sharing power. It's not a democratic system. It's a kind of a benign feudal system. So
this is a higher. I mean, Seventh Generation is not a greenwashing company.
Okay.
So I'm hoping that it is a little heavier than normal.
Right.
So the suggestion is we should look for some other alternatives that might be evolving of different models beyond the current model.
Economic democracy, environment, and all these things together.
Can I ask you a quick personal question? You teach at Benedictine?
Right.
Is it a Catholic?
Yes.
And you teach these things at the Catholic school? I'm curious. I'm an academic too. But nobody questions me because I'm where I teach.
Yeah.
You get away with this?
Are you using the current Pope?
Yeah.
I recite the Pope.
He's a
Hey, capitalism is harmful. The Pope says it. And no, actually,
The question is, can you as Benedictine speak about social democracy?
I think they've been very. Actually, they've been very good to me, so they have been supportive. I use my book. I mean, in my economics class, my basic economics class. And I do talk about these things. I talk about Marx. I talk about all this stuff. It's not in the standard economics curriculum for sure. And the students love it. I think a lot of it is the students. I mean, if the students like it, then the administrators, okay, that's sort of, because I was earlier at Roosevelt actually, when I came to, which one would have thought would have been a much better, situation, more compatible. I thought so. The department's a radical department. It's the only radical economics, program, in Chicago, the Chicago area. And I was run out by the administrators because part of that was that I was teaching required courses for business students, economics for business students, and they were sending me out to the suburbs because I was the new guy on the block. So, oh yeah, you Brian, you teach those classes up in Arlington Heights, or where they had all these satellite places, and the students they did not like.
So it doesn't go down every place.
Yeah, it doesn't. But I think the new generation has made, Bernie, I think, it's just all the people see democratic socialism. Oh yeah, maybe that's what we need.
We want to thank you. It's time for personal sharing. Does anybody have anything they want to share with others who
We
came here
have
today?
3 cards for members. It's 3 birthdays in December. One
Cards
is
for
for
birthdays
Harvey
over here.
Borzov, one is for Tony Zakia, and one is for our own Joanne Hefner. So please sign the card. And then we have refreshments.
If you're new to us and you do not receive our emails, please sign up on the literature table if you'd like to receive emails. And there's also a calendar of upcoming events. Please pick those up. This Tuesday at 8:30 a.m. is an opportunity to volunteer at the Protos-Mobile, Robert Crown Center, which is just nearby, on 1701 Main Street in Evanston. That's Tuesday at 8:30. This Thursday at 6 p.m. right here, the ethical issues discussion in the library. That's a week earlier than usual. And then next Sunday at 2 p.m., a monthly business meeting at the home of Jan Kuhn and Jeff Kramer. And then I have a closing quote before you can have other discussions. And that is from Felix Adler. Act so as to elicit the best in others, and therefore you will bring out the best in yourself. And perhaps that would have a collective impact on the larger society we live in. Thank you all for coming. do enjoy both sharing some of the additional ideas that you have here, as well as food and debate. Thanks all.